A common atheist objection to Jesus is, he's not scientifically proven. However, the scientific method applies only to events that are observable, measurable, and repeatable. The scientific method does not apply to history, because history is not measurable or repeatable. The life of Christ was a historical event, so the scientific method does not apply. Trying to disprove Jesus with the scientific method is like trying to put out a candle by flipping a light switch. It's the evidentiary method that is used to examine historical events. The evidentiary method applies to events that have evidence, such as eyewitness testimony. Almost all the evidence for the life of Christ is in the form of eyewitness testimony. Don't hide behind the scientific method. The evidence is ready for your consideration.
Atheists often claim that Jesus never existed. If that is true, then we should expect to find at least some support for the Christ myth theory, as it's called, in history. So, is there support for the Christ myth theory in ancient history? Nope. In fact, it took about 1,800 years for anyone to argue in print that Jesus never existed, like Bruno Bauer. There are lots of documents that talk about Jesus from around the 1st and following centuries, but none ever claim Jesus was a fictitious character. So the Christ myth theory gets no help from actual history. However, the Christ myth theory did have brief popularity in the Soviet Union. One of the first Christ myth writers, Bruno Bauer, was teacher and mentor to Karl Marx, the founder of communism. It was not supported by academic pursuits in the Soviet Union, but by government violence. The Soviet Union, in their anti-religion campaigns, arrested, imprisoned, and executed thousands of ministers and martyred millions of Christians. This was done to support Soviet atheism, of which the Christ myth theory was a tenet. Even decades of violence could not completely stomp out the idea that Jesus existed. In fact, before the popularity of the internet, the Christ myth theory had nearly fizzled out. Now it is mostly promoted by bloggers and self-published authors who don't have a relevant academic degree. That's why Oxford, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, Columbia, Cornell, Cambridge, and all the other universities employ and publish scholars who teach that Jesus existed. Does history prove that Jesus actually existed? There are 3 categories of ancient sources that talk about Jesus. Opposition sources produce documents that show them to be enemies of Jesus or the Christian religion. Neutral sources mention Jesus for documentation purposes, but are not for or against him. Affiliated sources produce documents that represent allegiance to Jesus or Christianity. Here are a few opposition sources from ancient history and some of the things they claimed. Celsus in True Discourse, rabbinic writers in the Talmud, Tacitus in Annals, Galen in various writings. Here are a few neutral sources from ancient history and some of the things they claimed. Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews, Suetonius in Lives of the 12 Caesars, Marabar Serapion in a letter to his son, and Phlegon in Chronicles. Here are a few affiliated sources from ancient history and some of the things they claimed. Paul in 13 biblical writings, John in 5 biblical writings, Peter in 3 biblical writings, and Luke in 2 biblical writings. Placing all of these claims on a diagram will help to show the pattern. They didn't agree on much, but they did agree on at least one thing: that Jesus existed. All of the ancient historical sources that reference Jesus, whether affiliated, neutral, or opposition, agree on at least this one fact: Jesus existed. How do you know that God exists? The teleological argument claims that nature is so complex it must have had a designer. The cosmological argument claims cause and effect as proof that the universe must have had a first cause. The ontological argument claims that a maximally good God could not exist only in thought, but must exist in reality as well. Although these approaches have had some influence, the best evidence that God exists is not in philosophical arguments, but in an actual person. The person who proves God's existence is Jesus. The philosopher Saul of Tarsus once said that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. How could Jesus prove that God exists? Jesus' life was foretold centuries earlier with detail and accuracy by a host of people who claimed to speak on behalf of God. Assuming the Gospels are reliable, only the existence of an intelligent being who knows the future can account for this phenomenon. Jesus affirmed that these prophecies were about him when he said to the Pharisees, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." Assuming the Gospels are reliable, Jesus' public supernatural actions can only be accounted for by the existence of an active and intelligent supernatural being. He often called God his Father and claimed that his supernatural actions were God's own actions at work through him. Jesus once said, "The Son can do nothing by himself. Whatever the Father does, the Son also does." Jesus said that we should believe in God because of the supernatural works that he performed. He said it this way: "Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me," or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Jesus claimed to be the human form of the invisible God. He said, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Also, I and the Father are one, and before Abraham was, I am." The skeptic might argue that Jesus' story is made up, or that the Gospels are not trustworthy. However, even a skeptic would admit that if the Gospels were proved to be trustworthy, it would prove the existence of God. So, are the Gospels trustworthy? The Gospels are Greco-Roman style biographies. These historical documents are eyewitness accounts of mostly public events. They were written shortly after the events they describe and were circulated during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. The Gospels survived the scrutiny of the thousands who saw Jesus firsthand, and yet there are no documents from that era that claim that the Gospel writers lied about what they saw. Those that had him executed would have loved to claim that the stories were false, but couldn't, because there were so many eyewitnesses. Instead, they had to claim in the Babylonian Talmud that he did his supernatural work as a sorcerer. A number of non-Christian historians like Tacitus, Pliny, Josephus, and Lucian wrote about Jesus shortly after his life and acknowledged various details mentioned in the Gospels. Many of the events, locations, and characters in the Gospels have been historically verified and are better documented than the vast majority of events in antiquity, with around 5,000 ancient Greek manuscripts. There is yet to be found any archaeological or historical evidence that contradicts the Gospels. In fact, the Gospels and Acts have predicted the location of a number of sites before they were discovered, such as the Pool of Bethesda, Siloam, Phrygia, Nazareth, and many more. Many of the Gospels' recorded events are supernatural and take place in fulfillment of publicly known prophecies written centuries earlier. The gospel writers could have spared their lives by ceasing to talk about Jesus. Instead, they became willing martyrs to prove that the Gospels are authentic and trustworthy. Many atheists have set out to prove that the Gospels are unreliable, but have become believers in the process. Here is a short list of well-known atheist-turned-believers converted while trying to prove the Bible unreliable. Historian and statesman George Littleton, surgeon and foreign diplomat Viggo Olsen, royal professor of law Simon Greenleaf, dentist Job Martin, journalist Lee Strobel, biology and geology professor Gary Parker, poet Gilbert West, scientist who led the Human Genome Project Francis Collins, archaeologist who sought to use archaeology to disprove Luke and Acts Sir William Mitchell Ramsay, lawyer, journalist, and novelist Frank Morris, illusionist who set out to disprove Jesus' miracles Andre Cole, Oxford scholar and author C.S. Lewis, cell biologist and professor Dr. Richard Lumsden, astronomer and astrophysicist Dr. Hugh Ross, and many, many more. After intensive research of the Gospels, these honest scientists, doctors, professors, lawyers, diplomats, and writers put away their religious prejudice and admitted that they had been wrong. What about you? Have you done your research? New question on questions from atheists. This one goes like this. How do you know the Gospels aren't fiction or legend? Really great question. Here's my response. The Gospels were written in the style of Greco-Roman historical biography. As with all biographies of that time, it was customary to write these within the lifetime of other eyewitnesses so that the story could be agreed upon. Internal evidence within the text shows that these books of the New Testament were originally penned before the eyewitnesses of Jesus and his life had died. Since the New Testament was written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses, it means that the information was falsifiable. The early date of the original documents ensured corroboration from other surviving witnesses. Scripture is even specific enough to give us a number of eyewitnesses to the resurrected Christ when it says in 1 Corinthians 15, "After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." Luke, in explaining why he wrote his gospel, used the words eyewitnesses, orderly account, and that you may know the certainty. It's clear from reading these authors that they claim to not only be eyewitnesses, but that they enjoyed the corroboration of hundreds of other eyewitnesses. So clearly the authors of the Gospels did not feel like they were writing fiction. They clearly presented their stories as fact. Thanks. I wanted to answer a question from questionsfromatheists.blogspot.com. So here's the question. Why are there no Roman records of Jesus? This is a really good question. So the silence of antiquity is what this is often called. It goes something like, the Roman Empire kept extensive records, so why is Jesus' trial and crucifixion not recorded? Why did Pontius Pilate not write about Jesus? Why didn't Herod's court make a record of Jesus? Often a string of ancient names who are contemporaries of Jesus will be listed, and then it will be pointed out that none of them mentioned Jesus. Now that's kind of like pulling 100 books from the 1920s off the shelves of the library and saying, none of these books mention Babe Ruth, so he must not have actually existed. The bottom line is very few records from that time have survived. Even Pontius Pilate himself only has a few surviving references that verify his historical existence. We only have one reference to Pontius Pilate by a Roman historian, and that reference was only there to give a frame of reference to who the sect of Christians were. So the only reference to Pontius Pilate is in reference to Jesus, in a way, indirectly. So most of what we know about Pontius Pilate actually comes from the Bible. There are a couple of things we need to remember. Jesus was only famous with a very small amount of people within his lifetime. Why would anyone write about him outside those who were his followers? Secondly, we don't know whether Pontius Pilate or Herod or any other Roman officials ever wrote about Jesus, because so many of the Roman records did not survive. There may have been records about him, but we don't have any of the notes or records from Pilate's administration kept from that time frame. Be sure you caught that line They are gone, burned, eradicated, non-existent. This is the case with most of the documents and records of that time. The only way documents survive through the centuries is if they are copied. Copying had to be done by hand. It was expensive. Only the most important documents would be kept. Why would the execution record of one so-called insurrectionist survive? After all, people were being executed by the thousands all over the empire. This sounds like an intelligent argument until you understand what small number of documents have actually survived through the centuries. When you consider the scant amount of documents that we have from antiquity, it's actually extremely stunning that we have so many documents about Jesus. It's almost unthinkable that so many were deemed valuable enough to be copied over and over, considering the expense attributed to that. The only reason that this would be is if something really important, like real live divinity in Jesus, actually existed. So, that is the response to why are there no Roman records to Jesus. It's not exactly true that there are no Roman records. This is just a side note. There are some records by historians that lived in the Roman Empire to things that were related to Jesus. So there's not that there's no reference. There's just no reference by the Roman Empire. I guess that'd be a better way to say it. So, anyways, thanks for watching.
How other religions began. Someone had a private idea about God, or someone had a private dream about God, or someone had a private encounter with an angel. Then that single someone told the rest of the world. This makes other religions impossible to verify because there are no eyewitnesses of the prime event. How Christianity started. Jesus spent 3 years doing miracles and teaching publicly. Jesus was executed publicly. Jesus was buried and rose from a public tomb publicly. Jesus showed that he was alive publicly. Then it was the public that told the rest of the world. Christianity is the world's most testable religion.